what's up, man?
Hey, man. Good to see you. We're making this a regular thing.
We're on a trend. We're back doing episodes regularly. Let's see how long it takes us to break it. It is summer after all.
I know. Yeah. It finally showed up here.
Here it is, even for you in Maine. I was thinking, and maybe it was just having a recent birthday. It makes me reflect. I can be a little nostalgic.
Happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
I didn't get to celebrate it with you this year like we did last year. But
no, I think last year's was good enough that we have a couple of years to build up before the next blowout. But yeah, maybe next year. I was thinking there's a topic that we've kind of spread out over time. It's kind of peanut buttered through a number of episodes. And I was thinking it might be interesting to have a discussion where we really think about what were the key decisions that we took, knowingly or otherwise, in our lives as adults that led us to the fire path and things that really accelerated our ability to achieve financial independence. And, it's another one of those things where I feel like there's an 80-20 rule at play. Yeah. I don't know how you think about it, but this was kind of the genesis of what I thought maybe we could talk about.
Yeah, and just to frame it up for if you're a new listener, don't know us, we're both in our 50s, early 50s. Jason just turned 51. I'm 50 as we're recording this in June of 2024. And so this is all with a lot of hindsight here, with the benefit of hindsight. And I don't want to pretend myself like all of this was architected out from the beginning, some big master plan that I was filling in on. I didn't come to the FIRE movement until like late 2019. And that's thanks to you. So a lot of this stuff, maybe we had some good financial ordering principles in place, underlying structure in place, but I'm not with the benefit of hindsight, maybe we can help others who are following in our path.
Yeah, I like the way you put that, because one of the things I definitely found, and it's sounding like you maybe had the same approach or same realizations, was that, there were some key things that were, kind of done eyes wide open, like this will help get me there. Yep. And then there were decisions that had a theme behind them, but there was no certainty that they were going to be the best path to achieving those, goals by any given date. And it is only with hindsight that we get the chance to say, well, how did those things really fit together? And I think that's kind of the fun part. And yeah, hopefully there are lessons in there that are generally applicable.
So looking back, what can you say with certainty the 80-20 of this path for you has been?
Yeah, I think 20% of it was stuff that gets a lot of airtime in the FIRE community. It was, paying ourselves first, prioritizing investing, putting bonuses away, like all that financial stuff. We'll talk about that. But 80% of it for me was what you have termed career leveling up. My strategy of kind of, growing as quickly as I could in income, in level, and what have you, so I could, just kind of turn that crank harder and be able to save more and be able to enable the next opportunity. There were no big payouts in here that kind of got me there. Like, it wasn't like, hey, 30 years old, my startup got bought and boom, I'm done. But 80% of it was definitely attributable to kind of that career path. How about you? What's your 80-20?
Yeah, for sure. Starting a business for me. And I would say that was less of a planned event in my life. Unfortunately, I kind of wanted that to be, I had always kind of held this idea about starting a business up on this shelf that I would kind of trot out and say, oh yeah, I'm going to start this someday. And when I was 39, there was a specific set of circumstances in the firm that I was working for at the time, which basically forced me to say, hey, like, if you're going to do it, now would be a really good time to do it. The global financial crisis was kind of grinding to a bottom point here in Maine, and the residential architecture market had kind of fallen off a cliff, and I had taken a 25% pay cut, and I was just like, all right, now's the time. And so I trotted that out, and it ended up being a huge financial risk for Laura and I to make that leap, just to walk away from a steady paycheck. And it ended up being the best financial decision of, our lives together. And so, that's the 80-20 of it for me. I can look back and say, maybe out of luck, that some of these other things kind of fell into place, having a little bit of financial education early on, knowing that I wanted to start saving in 401k plans when at my first job. And, some of the pieces kind of fell into line, and obviously, a lot of luck, who I was born to and where I was born in the world. So it's hard to discount those things, but looking back, yeah, for sure. Starting a business that made this possible.
Yeah, I like several aspects of what you said there. I think taking them in reverse order, this idea of luck, let's just get that out of the way early. You and I have talked about this. People commented on it sometimes if they're watching one video in a vacuum. I think we're pretty good at acknowledging that all of us who are watching this on YouTube have had some measure of good fortune into where we're born and how we were raised or what have you. But there were other things that we benefited from a lot, as did many people in our age group or a little younger or a little older, including the market, right? There was a 12-year bull run that we were able to take advantage of along with other people. And in my case, for sure, that came during my, highest earning years, and was able to get the leverage from that increased ability to invest to have it pay off in terms of gains. And, we don't get to pick what the market does. We're beholden to it. The second idea, and I suspect we're going to touch on this as we go here, is this idea of risk taking, because there's foundational good financial stuff that I think is table stakes, and I suspect you agree. But then there's how and where do you take risks that enable that kind of leveling up that you need to kind of change the calculus here, right? How do you, if you're not going to have some big windfall, how do you manage to pull in that retirement date or that date where you could retire if you wanted to, that financial independence? And risk taking for both of us, whether it's starting a business or going to early stage companies and being willing to move around, those are definitely risk taking.
Yeah. And what I think is interesting is that I don't think either one of us really had that as a narrative to our upbringing. I don't feel like I definitely didn't have that for myself. Yeah. My folks both worked for other people their whole lives. And I think that kind of anti-risk sentiment was kind of baked into how I was brought up. It's like even a couple of years into having my business, my mother still would ask me whenever we would get together, like, how's the job search going? Are you looking for another job? I'm like, no, this is my job. I made a job for myself. And I think that may be a generational thing that they had a hard time kind of trying to understand and digest. I don't know what it is, but that risk taking, I don't feel like was baked in. But now, I look, my brother-in-law has his own business. My sister has her own business. My wife I consider her to have her own business, running her own scientific research lab.
Oh, yeah.
And, I look around at my friends, and like more of them than not have stepped out and taken these risks, because I think in a lot of ways it's been normalized now. I think entrepreneurship has.
Yeah, and other people have written about this better than you and I are going to be able to speak to it. But some of this is going to be generational, right? Yeah. For us, we're Generation X. For especially older millennials, we were raised by parents who had been raised by people that got through some really tough financial times. We're talking about the Great Depression, World War II, and so our grandparents passed those lessons on to our parents' generation. And so I think my parents definitely didn't have risky career tracks, right? They did some tried and true, worked very hard kinds of paths to provide for their families and give us a good upbringing. There is one lesson that I suspect we both learned. I know for me it was a bit of a guiding principle. It was, if you work hard and you foster your talents and that's how you guide yourself, things are going to work out. Right. And I know for me, that was a big part of being less afraid about taking leaps, especially after I had done it kind of once or twice. It's like, I was raised with that idea that, if you work hard, it's probably going to work out. Now, maybe that was just a naive belief on my part, because clearly hard work isn't enough for everybody. But
well, I'll tell you,
it is something that empowered me.
I can see that for you. But I can also see the other side of that for me. I was working
Yeah.
hard for a firm for many years and I wasn't rewarded. And I think a lot of people equate the safety of a paycheck with something that's maybe going to continually improve or slowly improve. And I think you're leveling up the career, making all the career moves that you did to get to a certain position right before you RE'd. That doesn't happen without taking risk and moving.
It doesn't.
Continuing to move on and move up and move forward. And, I can see that for Laura's career. She's been at the same place for quite a long time. And you definitely make sacrifices for that. You gain in some areas, but you sacrifice in others. And
Right.
would you say you started that strategically in your 20s, in your 30s? Like, when did this start for you?
Yeah. So I went to grad school, and that meant that I didn't enter into the workforce right away after school. So I think I was 24 when I started my first job at a startup. And it didn't occur to me right away that was the path to take, because I'll tell you, I went to a pharma company as my second role, and that was the stable place that all my friends kind of hoped to get right from that startup. Like, oh, they've got great benefits.
Yep.
You work a fixed schedule. You go to the gym in the middle of the day. All that was true, by the way. Subsidized lunch. It's kind of the way people talk about like software engineering these days.
Yep.
But, I realized that life wasn't going to be it wasn't going to get me to where I wanted to go. And so I think the first move I took, not with the intention of getting to 5 faster, it was just getting to a more rewarding, fulfilling, exciting career.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
It ended up being a really important pivot in the year 2000 when I left that job, because I went to a startup and really kind of convinced myself that was the right environment for me.
Uh-huh.
And also, fortunately, I met my now wife, who helped me really coalesce my thinking on retiring early. So it was an unintended pivot, and it kind of, really got to start to drive that risk-taking engine pretty early in my career.
It was very similar for me. When I started my business when I was 39. So quite a bit later than you coming to this realization, but it was for the very same reason. I was just so dissatisfied. I couldn't do another day in that in that work environment. And I wanted autonomy. I wanted to self-direct. I wanted creative freedom. I wanted to own my own time. And the financial considerations were almost an afterthought. I hate to say it, but I had the privilege of, having a working spouse. Laura was earning a good living, and we could start the business because we knew we had some cushion there. And I know not everyone has that luxury. And so maybe that's what allowed me to focus less on the finances. But as soon as I got into that position, I started focusing hard on the finances. And I was like, I'm building a runway so that I never have to go back to that situation. But it was for those very same reasons. I think that's super interesting. But it didn't end there for you. Like for me, this has been my kind of terminal job. Like I made a job for myself. I designed it the way I wanted to, and it's worked out. For you, you kept marching up. How many years did you stay at a company before you would leave typically?
In the early stages of my career, it was typically 2 or 3.
Yeah. That's
it was
short, man.
It was. But I mean, and maybe it'll make sense with a little context, but I want to back up just a step. So is the first key decision for you, I am going to go out on my own? Or is there something before that really powered the path?
I mean, I always wanted to self-direct. I always wanted to do it, but
then you took the decision.
I needed an inciting event for that. Unfortunately. I mean, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that, to be honest.
I don't think you can be embarrassed. I think that should be the farthest thing from your mind.
They
personally.
Say, I appreciate that. But they always say, when the situation that you're sitting in becomes more uncomfortable than making the change and moving into the unknown, when that becomes more comfortable than where you're at, then it's an easy and obvious decision. And that's kind of what happened to me. It was like, this is too uncomfortable to stick around here, and I'm getting paid less. So like the security of the paycheck kind of went away, and I was like, well, what am I doing this for? And so I think, taking that decision, and I did take it in almost an instant. I called Laura. I went into work one day and we had this conversation with my boss, and I just said, well, that's not going to work for me. And I took it in a day and called Laura. I was like, that's it. Guess what? I just started 30 by 40. And, I had been laying the groundwork for it kind of on the side a little bit, but, it was not a serious venture. It's a first decision, but it wasn't a final decision. It wasn't like I had the business baked into a little cake and I was trotting it out and the thing worked. It's like you took these decisions along the way to level up, and you were doing that at a certain point for very strategic reasons, right? You wanted to earn more money, but you're also kind of changing roles.
Yeah.
I was doing the same thing. I started off as this kind of singular version of what I pictured an architect to be, but then I kind of expanded and I was like, well, no, actually I'm doing this and this and this. And I added all these other hats, which I personally loved. And that's part of the benefit of, inventing your own job, is that you get to call shots. You can, choose what you work on. You made some very specific moves away from some of the stuff that earlier had made you happy, right? As a scientist.
I had figured out by a certain stage in my career that, learning different things and challenging yourself, of course, is a path to growth. But I had always still done that in the context of a scientist, whether I was practicing science at the lab bench myself or pretty quickly on the management side, leading R&D teams. But I came to this realization in about 2009 that, in fact, I was kind of topping out, and I didn't see myself getting to the goals I wanted to get to staying on the research side. I was at a very comfortable company, a very large multinational, had acquired one of the startups I worked at, and kind of had a trajectory set for me that I could have followed. A lot of lifers at that company that I was now a part of. Yeah. But I knew I didn't want that. And so one lunchtime, and I've never told this story on Two Sides of Five before, maybe you don't even know it. We used to go out for Japanese food once a week on Mondays because it was so-called Sake Monday. And that's because you got free sake with your lunch.
Oh, God.
So needless to say,
disaster.
It was a disaster. After one lunch in particular, and maybe a little extra sake, a few of us were applying for new jobs. Not even kidding. And now it worked out really well for everybody. A bunch of us made pivots that really changed our trajectories. And mine was to walk across the parking lot to another building on our company's campus and interview with marketing. Now, I didn't do it that day, but I did send an email that day to the head of marketing and said, you know what, you're looking for technical product managers, and those are scientists who are on the business side. And I was like, why can't I do that? I just had this thought that, I might want to do something different. And the more I thought about it, had talked about it over that lunch and talked about it with Lori when I got home, I was like, maybe that's the next thing for me is kind of growth in all the things I could do with this base of knowledge I have. And so that was a pivot, 100%. Just doing that year and a half in marketing that came from that lunch.
Yeah. I love that sake was to blame for one of the major pivots in your life. It's funny when I get drunk with my friends around here, I just buy domain names and invent businesses.
I've done that too.
I consider that as an extreme vice of mine. I have so many domain names built up in my roster in Bluehost, man. It's ridiculous, but that's cool, man. Yeah, I love that because it's your own version of kind of that little nudge that you needed.
I did, and I that move, for so many reasons, was so educational. I had such a great boss. He was just such a good mentor, really cared. He had this very European attitude about what the workplace should look like in the midst of this kind of biotech framework, which in the US definitely looks a certain way, and it's not the most comfortable environment. And so I was kind of learning new skills, learning marketing from a guy who I thought had a really great mindset. And I learned a lot of hard lessons that year, year and a half before I pivoted to another startup. But that really did enable what I think of as that kind of third chapter of my career. And it was started from such a small thing.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So maybe that is a kind of a relevant lesson for something you did. What are there decisions you took that now you look at like, wow, I just kind of took that. It wasn't like a long, in-depth process. I just had this idea, and I went for it. Like,
I mean,
tell me.
So many of the things in the business that I started were done just out of, experiment's sake. Like I got I think I told you this before, but I was kind of desperate early on to earn income. And I was like, the average millionaire has something like 8 or 9 streams of different, income.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'm going to start. And so I wrote a book. I started blogging. I started a YouTube channel, and some of those things, the YouTube channel persists to this day, even though I'm not actively posting on it as much this year. But that decision alone turned into something really, really huge for the business, and that was something unexpected. It's allowing me to, explore filmmaking, and taught me how to use a camera and photography and all these other kind of meta skills that go on the back of having a YouTube channel, marketing, and I built a course business on top of that. And so those things allowed me to take different decisions in life. I encourage everybody who I coach who is trying to build a design business just to take risks. All profit is derived from risk. It's like one of my favorite quotes by Peter Drucker. And I think a lot of people are just too comfy in where they're at and choose not to take risks. The risks don't have to be very large. Writing a book was not a very big time commitment for me, but it opened doors that I never could have imagined. In the same way that applying for a marketing position, which is something that was not really in your wheelhouse, changed things for you. I love that arc. The narrative arcs are kind of overlapping here a little bit.
Yeah, and I like that. There's a lesson in there, and it's that risk taking doesn't mean you have to take giant leaps. But there are small experiments or things you can try on and see if they work for you. Like going into product management for me, I was definitely trying something on. I felt it was pretty low risk. I could just get another job at that same company where I was valued if I needed to. I didn't really worry about making that shift because I didn't think it would derail me. I could go back to the research ladder if I wanted to.
Yeah. Do you think there's things prior to these sort of life? I mean, we haven't talked about being in our 30s and starting a family. You and I both started family in our 30s. I bought a house when I was 34. The kids were pretty young. I had kids at 30 and 32. We didn't trot right into starting a family right after Laura and I got married. We took some time to travel around and kind of settle into our life as a married couple, and then wanted a house. But it's funny because buying a house now, it's a different narrative for people who are in that zone of the 30s, right? Given where interest rates are and where the real estate market is. You chose not to buy a house then, right?
I waited around the same amount of time, Eric. Okay. So basically, when I think about the 20% of the financial that I think was empowering for our FIRE journey, a lot of things happened in the same year, and they're all tied to starting a family. So, having a child, I was 33. Buying a house, buying a decent new car, all of that happened when I was 33. So I would say we did put off some things that are big financial undertakings. I mean, the interest rate environment wasn't amazing. I think my first loan was 6.5 or 6.65 or something like that.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, it was. Because I refinanced 2 years later.
Yeah.
But
mine
of
was
course,
5
then
and a quarter.
I ended up having to sell my house underwater during the 2008 financial crisis to move across the country. But yeah, I did wait, and I do think that for both kind of relationship, goals, right? Having the time together, doing the things we wanted to do when we were still relatively young. Not that 33 isn't young, but we intentionally waited, and we also, as much as we could, right? We were earning a lot less in those early years, but the more you can kind of pay yourself first in those early years, the better you're going to be. So I think that did pay off. But yeah, we waited for the larger financial undertakings for the family decision to be made.
How about debt? Can you remind me about student debt or any other debt? Because that's something, if you take a large amount of debt on in your 20s, that's going to be really hard to, number one, dig out from if you have a, naturally lower income. But also that's a time in your life where the savings lever is a lot longer than it is when you're in your 50s.
For sure.
So what did you have for debt? Just student loans?
Yeah, I just had some student loan debt. It wasn't oppressive. My parents and I each had some student loan debt that we kind of, took care of in those early years. But yeah, other than that, didn't have debt until I had a mortgage.
Yeah. And I had 10 years of
How
debt.
about you?
I had 10 years of student loan debt payments that
Yeah.
just paid the minimum payment. And then I took on some, auto debt. I took on a little bit of that, and Laura and I did. But it wasn't we didn't carry big balances on our credit cards or anything like that. We weren't fighting against that. Like I know a lot of people are, if you have a spending habit in your 20s and you don't keep on top of it, man, it can really, really catch up with you and stick with you for many, many years.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So starting the business, doing the experiments, did that trajectory change substantially in terms of decisions you took, or was that, what's the mix of like organic business growth and you did specific things that really changed the inflection of that curve?
The inflections that happened were all intentional by me.
Okay.
And, even one of the latest moves I made just about a year ago, I hired this agency to work with, and that was another kind of bend point in the business earnings. But I mean, I think it was all built on the early work that I did. So the business is now 11 years old, and the early work that I did building an audience on YouTube and Instagram, those things pay off big dividends. And I happened to do it at the right time, when not a lot of people were making content like that.
Right.
And I built a pretty big audience. And once you have a big audience, you can decide what you want to do with that. And, I decided to make courses and really double down on that over the past couple of years. And so, I could work with individual clients and have a fantastic business, but it wasn't the business that I wanted, because I didn't want to trade my time one for one. And so I think the big turning point in the business was saying, I'm going to move from a services business model to a services and products business model. So I'll still work with clients, but I'm just going to take one at a time, and do very, select projects. And I'm going to use that project to then support the product side of my business. And so I would say that big pivot, made a big difference. And then I think you and I had talked in the past that there was a certain runway that I was building. And at a certain point I said, this doesn't make sense. Like, I got to do something with this. And you and I happen to have a conversation, and you're like, oh, well, I'm getting ready to retire early, and this is my plan. And that kind of opened the door to the FIRE movement, and really me having a financial awakening, saying, wow, I can't believe I missed this, and then revisiting all of the 20% that you and I are saying, like, okay, let's get the financial house in order. So if I had to, pick that turning point, it would be like end of 2019. And here we are, 2024, just a couple of years later, proof that, if you have all the pieces in place and you start organizing them and you have an overarching plan to plug into, that you can do it in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah. I like that, because again, I think there's generalizable lessons in there. I mean, yes, you have some specific things about building an audience early on, but I mean, clearly you still are taking specific decisions, like, know when you need help, know when you need other resources to help, because none of us are infinitely scalable.
Yes.
Right. We're just not. No matter what bosses, for those of us who work in corporations or companies, think, right, you can only get so much blood from that stone, right? You can be the most creative, hardworking person you are, and you are incredibly hardworking, but sometimes there's benefit from other hands or other eyes and brains on a problem, and you've clearly seen benefit from that. So that's awesome.
I mean, the past year has taught me that for sure. And again, another learning, which I feel sort of naive for not realizing before, even though people like you and others have, advised me to get help in. It strikes me, Jay, of all the things that we can do to reach financial independence, increase our income, reduce expenses, invest, maybe increase savings rate, that the 80% is really, I don't know, I would characterize it as probably the more difficult thing to do, and that is increase our income, right? That's the career leveling up, starting a business, scaling a business.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's not really talked about as much?
Wow.
Is it just because it's so hard? I mean, it's not easy, right? It's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not easy. And in some careers, there's not an obvious trajectory to do it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's much harder in some areas than others, for sure. But on the other hand, I think it's, it's a great example of the FIRE community gets an unfair reputation that it's only people who are software engineers that just start at a high base pay and they save a large percentage of their pay from the beginning. There's all these other people that have to figure out how they get there. And no matter how much you constrain expenses, there's still a need for income and income growth to be able to pull this off sooner. So maybe it's just that it's harder to generalize, that it doesn't get as much airplay, or many people think that it's just such an individual path, or it's a mix of good fortune and hard work. I don't know. It doesn't fit into nice little sound bites and bullets like a lot of fire community things do. But I mean, let's face it, unless you're going for the leanest possible approach, income growth is going to be the surest path to having more funds to invest, and therefore leverage that, multiplier you get by saving as much as you can as early as you can.
Yeah. And I think,
what do you think?
Well, the reduced expenses can be really appealing. I listened to Ramit Sethi's podcast, Sure. I'll Teach You to Be Rich. And a lot of people kind of micro optimize. Like they get the Mint mobile phone, and they're not going out for coffee anymore. And
card churning.
Yeah, he just really rails on that because that feels like the knee-jerk right thing to do, the easy thing to do. But when you look at it as a percentage of your overall budget, it's like these micro optimizations just don't really move the needle, like getting another job or a side hustle, or figuring out how to level up, or taking the risk to move from the East Coast to the West Coast. Like that's a big deal. And I'm not pretending that everybody can do that, but I do think it's one of the reasons like the fire movement gets this bad reputation, because this extreme focus on frugality, like extreme frugality. You and I are not like extremely.
We're not hyper frugal.
We're not hyper frugal. But I think we did focus on living at or below our means. I don't know what you did when you got pay raises, but I wasn't like, maybe we took a nicer vacation here and there, or I bought a chair. I remember this beautiful leather chair, which I still love to this day, but it wasn't like I just leveled up my lifestyle every time I got a raise. So there is that kind of, even if you're increasing your income, if your lifestyle is adjusting at that same rate, it's not going to work.
Yeah, we basically tried to avoid that, and that was an intentional decision.
Yeah.
And once we had jobs that paid us any kind of bonus, we just basically pretended we didn't get that bonus. We invested it all lump summed, and some of those lump sums were at ideal opportunities, right? Market was low. Hey, it's all going in. Cool. We tried not to have that lifestyle inflation, and I think we largely did a pretty good job until much, much later. We were in our 40s before I felt we started making purchases that made us kind of think twice, like, that seems a little luxurious.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we did.
I mean, the other thing I think that we haven't really touched on here is having a plan. And I didn't really have a plan until you and I started having these conversations. I had a loose plan about what I was going to save for retirement, but retirement always seemed like that far off date. And, it's funny because I read a comment on one of our videos that basically said, I hope I'll never retire, because it means that I have a job that I love and that I want to, work till the day that I die. And I think that fits so few people that you will retire. There will be a day when you retire, and not having a plan for it is just because it's, 20 or 30 years in the future, or maybe never. That's just no excuse for not having a plan. And I think you and I have talked ad nauseum about the safe withdrawal rate toolbox, which you and I both use as a planning tool. But also, knowing calculating your FI number, and knowing your burn rate, and what are your expenses. You have to know these things so that you can actually create the plan. And I'm a planner by nature, and I know you are. And it doesn't mean that FI number has to be a fixed point in space, because as you and I talk about leveling up lifestyle, we're in our 50s, right? We're traveling differently than we did when we were in our 30s, right? So I just think it's another thing we should be putting in the mix as something that, is a pivot point.
It is. And I think as soon as you realize that whether you call it fire or some goal you're working towards that you want to be, financially independent by, it forces you to start doing math and planning. And I think irrespective of when that happens, it's such a positive thing because, you can be that much more prepared and intentional. And I think that, I've said it before, I think that's the best thing about the FIRE movement is no matter what path people take, the fact that they're being deliberate and they're planning and they're knowing the variables involved, that's huge. That's only going to serve you well. And I think that's great.
It's funny, we had a graduation ceremony here for my youngest who just graduated high school, and we had all the family here. And I was just talking to some recent college graduates. So one of my nephews, both my nephews graduated college, and we just got talking about, their job. One of them had just gotten a job, and it's funny because the questions they had about financials are all things that could be easily answered by like the Bogleheads Prime Directive. Have you ever seen that flow chart on Bogleheads? Yes. Yeah, the Prime Directive or the Financial Order of Operations, the Money Guys show.
Or the index card to investing. Yeah, simple stuff.
It's just knowing where to put that next dollar is super important, and especially at that age. As I look at my kids in college, going into college, that is such valuable information because the savings lever and what you can do with your money at that age has a big impact by the time you get to be our age. And so hopefully you and I are going to be able to pass that along to our kids and maybe some people in our audience, how important that is, having a plan.
I hope so too. In the age we're in, where now car loans are 6 and 7 years for many people, it's just that much easier for the youngest people to get in difficult debt situations and not, be able to kind of take advantage of that leverage. I mean, irrespective, let's leave the price of housing aside because it's just such an onerous thing that both of us agree is kind of out of control. But that having that knowledge about where to, as you say, put that next dollar, that's so valuable. And both of us, while we did make a lot of great decisions, we weren't wired for that at 18 years old either. You've talked about some of the challenges. I've talked about some of the challenges that we had and poor decisions we made. I think we're going to link quite a few episodes in the show notes for this one about our pasts.
Yep.
But you're right. It's that could benefit everybody.
Would you have started the leveling up even earlier if you had known where it would lead?
Yeah. I mean, with the knowledge I have, it's always the benefit of hindsight. It's like, oh, what could I have done differently? Totally. What first move could I make in that the first 2 years could have been even bigger? I mean, it's hard for me to say definitely because the experiences I had, made me who I am today. So it's like, changing that sounds scary, but I don't know. How about you? I mean, so obviously so much about starting a business and running it at this stage. I have to imagine for you it's maybe an easier question.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things I would have done differently in the past 11 years. It's hard to, like you said, to really go back on decisions. But if I could change things, I'd hire people much earlier to help me out with things. I'd go at it even harder than I did kind of mid-span of the business. I'd publish way more videos than I ever did. I wouldn't care so much about what other people thought of me because I think I let that hold me back in a lot of ways. I thought people thought of me as singularly an architect, and I didn't embrace that for a long time. It's kind of like you not being willing to admit, hey, I'm retired.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I'm not really an architect anymore. I'm all these other different things.
Yeah,
I had a hard time accepting that. But starting a business, no question, man, that has been just life-changing. And I can't recommend it enough to anyone because even if you fail, you come away with way more tools in your tool belt than you did not having done it. And you don't want to be that person if you're ever contemplating doing something like that. You don't want to be that person in 10 years who looks back and says, geez, I never got to test out if I was the business owner. I don't know if I'm the entrepreneur, and there's only one way to find out. And that is to step into that risky space and just do it. And man, I think you can agree that even just retiring early, like that's another risky thing. That's something else that you step into not knowing. And you can plan all you want, and you can pretend like you have this great, map of what you're going to do with your business and how it's going to go, and it's going to be different. That the fact is, it's just going to be different than what you planned out, and you have to have some flexibility and an ability to adapt to a changing situation. I would do this all over again, and I'd start it earlier probably.
Yeah, I love that. And I think we've come up with a generalization of our strategies.
Yeah.
Get your financial house in order, but don't be afraid of taking risks, right? When you challenge yourself, when you take on things you haven't done before that are uncomfortable, it's when you have the biggest growth. We're not the first people to discover that, but both of us found ways to apply that to accelerate our trajectories and achieve these goals. Whether we set out to do that from the start or not, that's what enabled us to get there. And it's just a cool thing to sit back and have that perspective that we all have as we age on thinking,
sure.
Well, how did we get here? How do those points get connected? And risk and taking on risk and breaking out of comfort zones was a huge part of it.
Never say no to that free sake at lunch.
Never say no to that free sake for lunch. I also, a corollary is take the call, man. Stay in touch with your old networks.
Oh, yeah.
I was surprised so many times opportunities came up that I wasn't even looking for, and they were pivot points in my career as well, right? Neither of us have the time to go item by item and all the decisions we made in our careers, but it's that collection of decisions, and some of those are riskier than others, that get us where we end up at. And that's within all of our ability.
Yeah, man. Well, it's good chatting with you. Hopefully people got something out of this episode, and that's not just a standard kind of fire narrative of invest in low-cost index funds.
Yeah, I mean, we did that too from the beginning, but it's not enough.
Check the show notes for all the boring stuff that we did, because I'm sure you're going to do a nice little write-up there, Jason. I'm
going to do my best. Links right in the description, or if you're on iTunes, check out the description. It's the same thing.
All right,
Whether
man.
you're a podcast listener or a YouTuber, just go to the description. All right, man. It's been good catching up.
Good catching up, man. Chat soon.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.